What did Paul see in the sand that ignited his thirst? Jessica's hand trembled, not fear, tanks, but a mirrored sun's weight, blazed. Arrakis dead don't held its breath. Axolotl tanks stirred beneath, not for war, for ghosts, ancestors sand-born. Spice-made sand-born, their tanks mirrored Arrakis' cycle, create, consume, dead don't stay buried, spice never forgets. The spice remembers, beneath their tanks, the Tleilaxu did not breed soldiers. They clawed at time, resurrecting kin wiped by the Buttlerean blade. Axolotl tanks not for Gholas but for ghosts, a race unmade, reassembled in spice-fueled flesh. What if their horror was not the Gholas, but the echo of a voice long silenced? The original Tleilaxu raised, now only shadows remain, the sand consumes, the spice remembers. The Axolotl tanks were for ghosts, not Gholas. The Tleilaxu stitched their race from genetic thread, to breathe life back into a people erased by the Buttlerean jihad. Instead, they birthed simulacra shells with borrowed faces, hollowed minds refilled with stolen skills. The Imperium saw weapons. It saw tools, it stripped the tanks of their purpose, repurposed grief into an army. Their genetic masterface dancing, mentat enhancements emerged not from ambition, but accident. A people desperate to undie hacked their own code, unaware they were carving doors into mirrors. Each Ghola was a misfire, a side effect of a ritual meant to resurrect ancestors, not replicate them. The Tleilaxu princes who gazed into the tanks saw not triumph but failure, a species reduced to parts. A lineage dissolved into technique. What did the Imperium care for their sorrow? It needed soldiers. It needed pawns. The Tleilaxu were reduced to engineers of their own erasure, their science a chainmail of contradictions. They called it progress, they called it survival, but the tanks do not resurrect, they dismember, they take. And in the end, the Tleilaxu Gholas were not their ancestors, they were their epitaphs. The last Tleilaxu looks in the mirror, sees a stranger, and burns. The Axolotl tanks were not for Gholas, they were for ghosts. The Tleilaxu sought to stitch their race from genetic thread, to breathe life back into a people erased by the Buttlerean jihad. Instead, they birthed simulacrum shells with borrowed faces, hollowed minds refilled with stolen skills. The Imperium saw weapons. It saw tools, it stripped the tanks of their purpose, repurposed grief into an army. Their genetic masterface dancing, mentat enhancements emerged not from ambition, but accident. A people desperate to undie hacked their own code, unaware they were carving doors into mirrors. Each Ghola was a misfire, a side effect of a ritual meant to resurrect ancestors, not replicate them. The Tleilaxu princes who gazed into the tanks saw not triumph but failure, a species reduced to parts. A lineage dissolved into technique. What did the Imperium care for their sorrow? It needed soldiers. It needed pawns. The Tleilaxu were reduced to engineers of their own erasure, their science a chainmail of contradictions. They called it progress, they called it survival, but the tanks do not resurrect, they dismember, they take. And in the end, the Tleilaxu Gholas were not their ancestors, they were their epitaphs. The last Tleilaxu looks in the mirror, sees a stranger, and burns. The Axolotl tanks hummed with a wet, mechanical breatha sound like rusted gears gnawing through time. Their glass bellies glowed blue, casting shadows of dead men on stone walls. The Tleilaxu did not birth. They dissolved. A body cast into the tank would unravel, a snowflake in hot tea, until only genetic memory remained. What they called *ancestry* was a phantom limb. The Imperium came with hooks in its hands. It plucked Gholas from the tanks, reshaped them into weapons. But the Tleilaxu knew the truth. These copies were not their children. They were grave robbers, stealing faces from a necropolis the Tleilaxu had never built. The priests whispered, "We are farmers of our own ghosts." In the tanks reeked of iron, like blood left to rot. Leto Roman II famine time was a god's sneer. He starved entire planets, yet the Tleilaxu thrived. Their tanks needed no soil, no sun, only power, only secrecy, but their survival was a lie. The Axolotl tanks were not life, they were a dam holding back a flood of nothing. When the power failed, when the glass cracked, the Tleilaxu would dissolve first. A priest once pressed his face to a tank, watching his reflection splinter. Asterisk we are the echo asterisk, he thought, asterisk not the scream, asterisk the water tasted of ozone and old bone. The room smelled of burnt hair, the tanks still pulse, still breed shadows. But the Tleilaxu know, every Ghola born is a step closer to the day their ancestors finally drown. What if their Gholas were not weapons but pleas? The Axolotl Tanks sought to rebuild a race, lost to time a race the Imperium's reliance now dooms. Every cell a debt, every organ a dirge, will the ghosts awaken or consume their would-be sires? The Axolotl Tanks mirror Arrakis, buried cycle spice makers devoured, sand trout reborn. Both systems bind flesh to faith, but the Tleilax's design was colder. Their tanks did not breed warriors, they sought to unstitch time. From gene pools long drowned in war, they threaded ancestral DNA into glass lungs. What rose was not life but echo, not a soldier but a question. The Bene Gesserit's plan had no room for such ghosts. Their own schema-selecting Kwisatz Haderach, pruning human evolution crumbled against the honored matter's wrath, yet the tanks endured. They whispered of a truth the Imperium buried, the Tleilaxu were not masters of life. They were midwives to a corpse, each tank held a species' final breath, preserved for resurrection. But the Tleilax's ancestors were not gods, they were frail, mortal, and extinct. To force them back was to war against entropy. To call them was to summon a debt older than the Imperium's debts. The honored matters saw this. They burned the tanks not to kill Gholas, but to silence the past. Yet the glass walls still hum, they hold no secrets, they hold a requiem. A race's last heartbeat, frozen in service of a future that never came. The Imperium's spine is not built of spice or swords, it is built of borrowed time. And in the tank's silence the answer lingers. Will the ghosts awaken or consume their would-be sires? 273 words. The Axolotl Tanks slumber beneath stone and silence. Their waters hold no soldiersonly ghosts. What did the Tleilaxu bury so deep that even their enemies dare not name it? Secrets. The answer clings to the word like rust. Beneath the Imperium's gaze, the Bene Tleilax stitch corpses not to wage war, but to resurrect themselves. A lost race erased by time and machine, now reduced to husks in glass. The Dune encyclopedia whispers of failure. Yet the Imperium tolerates their abominations, Gholas, face dancers, the twisted seeds of a house that should not exist. The Tleilaxu once walked with thinking machines. Their histories were fire, their names scoured from the stars. Now they bargain with death to reclaim what they cannot remember. Each tank is a hollow heart. Each Ghola a question without an answer, and in the dark the original Tleilaxu rotten scene, unspoken, undone. The Imperium does not know, it does not need to. Some ghosts feed on secrecy. Others drown in it. The Axolotl Tanks are a mirror to the Imperium's soul specialization, and fragile its lifeblood and death sentence. Resurrection here is not rebirth, but a wound that never clots. The Tleilaxu did not build Gholas to conquer, they built them to remember. To stitch flesh to memory, to cheat the void that erased their first names. The Bene Gesserit saw this as heresy. To them faith is a weapon, to the Tleilaxu it is a shroud. Their tanks are silent altars, humming with the unfinished psalm of a species that forgot how to die. The golden path demands choice, the Tleilaxu offer none. Leto's empire of will fractures here, where survival is not a strategy but a hunger. The Imperium tolerates their horror because it understands it. All civilizations are houses of cards. One tremor and the Foundation's guild navigators, emperor thrones, sisterhood plots crumble like ash. The Axolotl Tanks are not a secret, they are a wound kept raw, a question left unanswered. What if the Tleilaxu were never monsters? What if they are the last echoes of a people who simply refused to let go? The Imperium does not look too closely. Some ghosts do not need to speak. Some only need to persist. Bene Tleilax did not build Axolotl Tanks to forge Gholas. Heretics of Dune reveals a darker truth that matters, rise forces a reckoning. The tanks hummed with a different hunger to stitch flesh from memory, resurrect a race that devoured itself before empire noticed. The Tleilaxu's ghost gnaws.